Background for this session, and then he will begin the process of introducing our speaker, Jeremy.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming back in so promptly from the break. So I'm real excited to introduce our next speaker, David Rennie from the UK's Identity Assurance Program. I know some of you in the room are intimately familiar with what they've been doing in the UK, even in some cases have been involved in both the IDAP program and the NSTIC program. In other cases, I think this may be entirely new to you. One of the things that's been very exciting to see from our perspective in the MPO since the launch of the NSTIC has been the launch of other efforts around the world focused around digital identity strategies that are, I would say, spiritually aligned with NSTIC in terms of putting a focus on partnerships with the private sector to drive an ecosystem of digital credentials and authentication services rather than have the government be the primary provider of these services. And I think there is probably no better example today of another effort underway that is spiritually aligned with what we're doing than what our friends are doing over in the United Kingdom. What's fun about collaborating with them, and we do quite a bit along with other countries, is that I think in 5 years we both might have something that looks very similar, but right now we are continuing to do completely different things and then occasionally loop each other and kind of weave back and forth with each other. There's the old joke that, America and Britain are two countries separated by a common language, and that sometimes resembles the interactions between our efforts and what they've been doing over there. But when we had some time in the agenda, it was suggested that it might be good to actually have them provide a quick update in terms of what is going on with the IDAP program, and that there are a lot of similarities to the struggles and challenges that we are dealing with over here. They have taken some really good innovative approaches to actually moving things forward, and so the thought was, let's have a session today where all of you can hear a little bit about what call it a distant cousin in Europe is doing along similar lines. So with that, I'm happy to introduce my friend David Rennie, who will be spending some time talking over the next 45 minutes to an hour over the phone, providing an update as to where their efforts are. So David, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I don't know if you can hear this.
Yes.
That sounds good. Okay, well, I'll carry on then. So I'm looking online at the back of a few heads, some of which are quite familiar. So I've never done a presentation from the back of the room to the back of people's heads before to an empty stage, but we'll see how we get on. Oh, there's a waving hand, a couple of waving hands. Hi there. So my name is David Rennie. I am Industry Engagement Lead for the UK Government Identity Assurance Programme. I'll just step you through what that program is, what we're doing. I know some people have heard this before, and apologies, but I'll talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll take questions. The Identity Assurance Program sits within something called the Government Digital Service, which sits within Cabinet Office. Cabinet Office is a central government department, small central government department, based here in Whitehall in London. And its focus is to coordinate policy across all the other government departments. So the government departments, the big ones, are the Department of Pensions and the tax collecting department and the health sector and such like. So Cabinet Office coordinates across those different government departments. We are pursuing a policy here in the UK called Digital by Default. Digital by Default stems from a policy created between our Minister, Francis Maude, Minister for the Cabinet Office, and Martha Lane Fox, who's the digital champion for the UK. And that report, the original document that stemmed from, was called Revolution, Not Evolution. Basically, here in the UK, public services are delivered by the telephone, face-to-face channels, with lots of bits of paper being sent through the post. The public sector in the UK doesn't really do very much digital, or hasn't traditionally done digital in the way that the private sector has. And Martha Lane Fox's report said that what is required is not a small and incremental change and a gradual improvement, but a revolutionary new approach to the way in which the public sector thinks about digital. And Government Digital Service was created at the heart of government to pursue that agenda. So it's revolution, not evolution. We have to think about designing all public services from the ground upwards to be digital first, and then we have to think about those people who can't use digital channels. We think of them as a secondary consideration. So we get it right for the 80% in the first instance. Now, that policy requires an understanding of who it is you're interacting with if you're going to design services to be entirely digital. And so the Identity Assurance Program sits within the Government Digital Service, GDS, as an enabler for that policy. So what does that mean for us? Well, effectively it means that the demand of public services in the UK has been aggregated, and the identity element of that has been removed from the jurisdiction of the departments, and a central policy has been applied across all central government departments. Now, that's quite unusual in the UK, that centralising approach. It's accompanied by a department called Efficiency and Reform who hold the purse strings. So that helps to enforce that policy, i.e. no government service is approved for budgetary purposes unless they can prove that they are meeting the requirements for identity assurance and a number of other elements. So that helps focus minds. So what are we doing? Well, we are, as Jeremy described, we are we're taking a federated identity approach. The UK is a common law country. That means that in legal terms, you can call yourself whatever you like. You get issued a birth certificate, but that doesn't mean you have to stick to that name. You can decide to be called whatever you want to be called. That differentiates us from the people across the other side of the channel, most of whom have a Napoleonic code. And under the Napoleonic code, they get told, or they decide what their name is, and they agree that name with the government, and then that is their name from there on in. And those countries tend to have identity cards, and we don't have an identity card. We had a policy under the last administration for introducing identity cards, and that wasn't very popular and was revoked by this administration. But we're still left with the challenge of how do you prove who somebody is? How do you trust who somebody is through a digital transaction when interacting with a public service? So we have introduced the Identity Assurance Program. It's a federated identity model, and we have been through a long and painful procurement, which has resulted in 5 private sector organisations being on a contract with central government to deliver identity services. And the procurement has been painful, and indeed, I'm sure the suppliers to the process would say that the whole conversation is quite complicated and quite painful. It's taken us a long time to get to this point, but we are not far from the point of launch. So we will be launching with two public services in the next few weeks. We will be launching in a private beta with a very limited number of end users, and those end users will, when they go online to access the first 2 public services, they will be offered a choice of the 5 identity providers, and they will select one of those identity providers, and then they will be required to meet a government standard for identity assurance, and that government standard has been published in a couple of documents called Good Practice Guides, which are available online. So the customer will have themselves a digital identity from one of those identity providers, and then they will be able to access the service. if I'd got my act together, I would have put together a presentation for you, and apologies that I haven't, but we have got slides. I can send them through afterwards, which show that experience for the customer, at least in its current form. So we're launching that as a private beta, what we call a private beta, and that means we'll have a limited number of pre-selected customers, and we will test how this works, and we will work out where the challenges are. And our plan is to move from private beta through to public beta by about the summertime. So we're expecting 6 months or so of beta testing, effectively, of these identity services. And by the end of the summer, we hope to be into a go-live situation. So we'll go to a fully live service. So we will gradually roll this out, looking at the issues as they arise and fixing them as we go. So we're taking an agile approach to delivery of identity services. We plan to have about 600,000 digital identities registered with government services in the next year or so, but that will depend upon how many problems we incur. So we're not fixed to any particular rollout path. But the intention would be by the end of 2014 and into 2015, this starts to become a much larger initiative with many more people involved. The two services that we're starting with are deliberately chosen to be interesting but not too interesting. So there's one service which will allow customers to look at the number of endorsements on their driving license. So if you drive in the UK, you get given points that go on your driving license. I'm pleased to report I have none, I think. But actually, I don't know what the DVLA, the organisation who administer that database, they might well have recorded a number of points against me. I can't see that information. So the insurance companies who give insurance to drivers are going to be given access to that database so that they can check people's suitability to drive and reflect that in their insurance premium. And obviously, if the insurance companies can see that information, then the individual citizens should as well. So again, we don't know how popular that will be. There's certainly been a little bit of press about it, that it's of interest to some people. I'm sure it will be interest to quite a few people over time. But it's the first service that we're starting with. The second service reflects your taxation. So in the UK, we have a system called Pay As You Earn, PAYE, and your employer takes the money directly from your salary before you actually see it in your bank account. And you just get a little slip from the HMRC saying, ha-ha, this is what we've taken. Now, that is all derived from a tax code, and nobody can understand their tax code. But the tax code varies depending upon the number of company benefits you have. So if you have a company car, then that is seen as a taxable benefit, and the amount of cash you have in your bank in your account at the end of the month after you've been paid will be commensurately lower. So if you give back your car, then obviously you should expect to see the money back in your account. But at the moment, it takes about 18 months for that to work through the system before you actually see the money back again. Under the new service, the new digital by default service, you should be able to see that money reflected in your next pay packet. So there are about 6 million people in the UK who change their company benefits per year, and we anticipate that a number of those will be wanting to look at that record. So those two transactions, the two that we're starting with in the first half of this year, they're of interest, and they will have significant numbers of people on them, but they're perhaps not the most sensitive transactions. The really sensitive transactions will be when we start engaging with the National Health Service, and we start looking at how we can allow citizens access to electronic health records. But that's some way down the line before that will happen. There'll be an awful, a lot of considerations before that type of service is accessed online. So we don't have a fixed timeline for which services are coming in when. Lots of government departments, in fact all the government departments, are working on delivering what we call exemplar transactions. There are 25 exemplar transactions. If you should be interested in what they are and what they do, it's all published on a website called gov.uk. So we're being as transparent as possible around the progress. We have a blog site as well, telling you how we're progressing with the contract with the identity providers and the various events that we're doing. If you like, we're up and running, it's complicated, and an awful lot of people here are involved, as you can imagine. Just before go live, there's a lot of pressure on the people working in the team. So that's real live delivery, if you like. But we also have an awful lot of questions to answer about a lot of elements of the scheme that we just don't know the answers to as yet. So to address those problems, we've been working with the Open Identity Exchange, and I know Don is there with you, the chair of the Open Identity Exchange. So Cabinet Office joined the Open Identity Exchange as an executive member in May 2012, and subsequent to that, we've been working with OIX to create a structure whereby we could work collaboratively with, firstly, our 5 identity providers, but then with the wider ecosystem of suppliers out there who have offerings. So we have formed something called, this is going to confuse you, we've formed something called the IDESG, the Identity Steering Group. I think that's missing a vowel from your group. So we have formed the Identity Steering Group, and that's made up of the Cabinet Office, UK Cabinet Office, OIX, and the 5 identity providers. And it is a steering group, and what it is steering is it's steering the spend of a grant that has been given by Cabinet Office to the Open Identity Exchange to progress collaborative projects. So this may all sound a little bit familiar to you guys. I think Jeremy has explained that they have a similar program over there in the US. Your budget is proportionately bigger than ours, unfortunately, but we're doing more or less the same thing. So we are running a series of what we call discovery projects and then alpha projects, which take a specific topic and look to work collaboratively on a cooperative basis amongst a number of different parties to progress a particular theme. So going back to last year, one of the projects we did was work with a local authority and the identity providers to actually do the first technical integration between an identity provider and a back-end local authority service. So that project was called the Warwickshire County Council project, and the findings from that project were written up in a white paper, and we've published that white paper on the OIX website if you should be interested. So we did actually 2 reports, one on the user testing that we do with every project to understand what users think, and one on the technical integration to understand how connectivity from the identity provider through to the end service, how that works and what the issues are with it. So we learned an awful lot from that project. That was delivered last year. We're now into a second project, and that second project will be looking at 2 things. One we call attribute enrichment, and the other one we call attribute exchange. In the attribute exchange project, what we'll be looking to do is allow the local authority to get an attribute which the attribute describes whether the person is registered disabled or not. In the UK, we have a blue badge scheme, and if you are a registered disabled person, then you can get a blue badge and park your car near the entrance to the supermarket or what have you. And it's the local authority who administer that scheme, but they need to be provided with evidence that the person applying is actually disabled. Now, at the moment, we have an awful lot of paper involved in that process, a lot of time, a lot of queuing at local council offices. The intention here is to test how somebody could do that online and get some trustworthy evidence from a suitable authoritative point that could be presented to the local authority, and they could then issue the blue badge without the paperwork. So that is, as I say, a discovery project at the moment. We hope to turn that into an alpha project in the coming weeks. So we're doing a number of projects like that. I could describe others in the portfolio. There's a number there. One of probably the most interesting ones we're doing is working with the mobile network operators, so the mobile phone providers, to understand how they can interoperate collectively as an industry through open standards with our identity providers. So that is that's a project that's currently underway, and when we have the results of that, we will again be publishing that. Our intentions through 2014 are to focus on delivery of the service, as I say, through private beta and then public beta. We are focusing on these discovery and alpha projects, and we're also looking at what we've called scheme rules, but is more commonly known as trust framework. So how do we devise a trust framework? Because we want to use the government sector, the aggregated volume that we've got from the public sector, to actually catalyse the private sector into adopting the use of identity services as well. So we're spending an awful lot of time talking to potential private sector relying parties, and I was actually talking to British Airways, who were very keen to engage with your international group through the IDESG to talk about could we embark on an international collaboration to do with people flying through Heathrow Airport or flying out of Heathrow Airport. So yes, we're looking to take forward those types of idea, and we're keen to work internationally. So if there are initiatives out there that could be presented to our IDSG, then we'd be very pleased to do that. So shall I stop there and draw breath for a moment and see if there are any questions? I see somebody running down the other side.
Yes, I think that would be a good thing to do. Thank you, David, for the presentation so far. I've asked Don Thibault to join me on stage here to help moderate the questions, and I believe we do have a question in the back. I actually can't see who that is because I'm being blocked. By the way, please stand as you ask the question so that our cameraman can show what you look like to David.
Thanks, David. Very interesting. Two questions. The first is, I believe the NSTIC effort is protocol agnostic. Can you talk a little bit about the stance of the UK Identity Assurance Program vis-a-vis protocols? Second question is related to whether or not you're doing any rules of engagement for your identity providers. For example, here in the US, there was a bit of a flurry when Yahoo changed their policy on email addresses and started to reassign those, and email addresses are often an anchor identifier for many applications. So if that has been reassigned, that could create some vexing problems. So are you contemplating or have you implemented any rules of engagement for your IDPs?
Yeah, thanks. I'm waving back here. You can't see me, but I see you. Yeah, so in terms of the technology protocols, I didn't really describe the architecture, but we have something we call a hub. I think everybody's got something they call a hub. It seems to be everybody and his wife have got a hub these days, but we have a hub which is effectively the interface between the public service and the identity provider. So we've built a hub here in GDS, and we're going to make that open source eventually. And that hub has been based on a SAML 2.0 protocol. So any of the identity providers who want to speak to that hub have to speak SAML 2.0, and the profile is going to be published in the next few weeks. But we would never, we have no intention of being bound by technologies. That was a starting position. We've written that protocol. Anything that happens beyond the identity provider, i.e. any communication between an identity provider and the data sources that they use to corroborate the identity information asserted by the individual, any protocol that they want to use, they can go ahead and use. Clearly, they have to meet government security standards, which we specified, but there's no constraint around what technologies they're using to do that, or what solutions they're using to do that. They don't have to do it digitally. They can do it. Actually, they do have to do it. They do have to be able to do it digitally. But if the customer wants to do it face to face, there's no reason why that couldn't happen. So SAML 2.0 is a starting point. There was a lot of discussion around what that protocol should be, and it was felt that was the best way to go to begin with. But in future, new protocols will be used, I'm sure. With regard to rules of engagement, the identity providers, if they were on this call, I don't know if they are actually, but if they were, I'm sure they would, have interesting comments to make around the contract that we agreed with them. It was a long and painful process drawing up that contract, and we wanted to be very sure from a government perspective that we were getting this right to begin with. One of the great concerns would be if we ended up that the whole scheme was brought into disrepute by poor behaviour on the part of one party. Now, I think that the 5 identity providers all have a good relationship with one another, and they all recognise that they are all, to a large extent, dependent on one another, and they don't want to spoil the party one for any other. We do have a lot of rules around what can and can't be done, and mostly they have to inform us before they do anything, before they take a step forward, which I'm sure they would complain about. And as we evolve and we begin to trust one another, I'm sure we will loosen some of those rules, but it's better to start off safe than too lax. I hope that answers the question, not specifically around rules around the identifier or the email that can be used. There are rules around what identifiers are used, but it doesn't specify that it should be an email or anything else.
So just to follow up on Ken's question a minute before we go to a question from the online session, I think Ken's question wasn't so much the specifics of what the identifiers are, but rather how you deal with the question of persistence of them and the fact that they might change. Did you select a set which are believed to be stable, or do you have a mechanism for changing the system when sort of core attributes change, or is that a future work?
Yeah, so the citizen himself can actually register with multiple identity providers, and the citizen can deregister with an identity provider and then re-register again, so he could create separate identifiers. On each account that is created by the citizen, the government standards around that identity have to be met. So if I've registered with all 5 of the identity providers, all 5 of them will have had to assure my identity to our high standard, and to the government standards. Now, each one of those accounts will have a separate and unique personal identifier, which is then passed across into government. So multiple identifiers are possible. In terms of how the customer authenticates to the identity provider, that is for the identity provider to manage. So if the customer has changed the authentication mechanism, so if in one instance it was using an email address and he decided to change that to authenticating using a mobile phone or in some other way, that will be the responsibility of the identity provider to manage.
Thank you. So now I'm going to go to questions from the remote session in order to give people who have degraded bandwidth a bit of an advantage. So, Kay, would you like to start?
Yes, the first question from the online audience is from David Moss, and he asks, the government digital service has said that all identity providers should be certified by T-Scheme so that people know they can be trusted. Only one IDP is certified, the others aren't, and so can't be trusted?
I believe that the rising inflection in the end of the voice was a question mark there, David.
They will all have to be, all the identity providers will have to be certified by T-Scheme before we go to full live. So they're all going through the certification process at the moment.
Thanks, and we have another question from online.
Next question is from David Weitzel, and he asks, did the UK consider the use of already existing credentials? If so, why did they reject that approach?
I guess the question back is when we refer to already existing credentials, and I'm not sure what that actually refers to. So there's no reason why the identity providers are putting together their propositions, and they will be using authentication mechanisms. I imagine most of them will be taking authentication mechanisms that they've bought from other providers. So it's up to the identity provider what credentials they issue to their customers.
So David, just
why?
So I guess to clarify a little bit, I think there might have been an implication in the question that these identity providers were all, created, from the head of Zeus rather than selected by a process of solicitation. But my sense is that what actually happened was that you went to the community of of existing identity providers and asked them to make proposals. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. We went through a standard government procurement. We put out a notice and we saw who responded to that notice, and we've contracted with organisations who showed an interest in delivering the service. So they will be registering their customers from scratch, and they will be issuing them with new credentials. We did think that we would attract banks, but the banks in the UK have been a bit busy of late worrying about monetary policy and various other things. So we have got a good engagement with them now, but they haven't stood up as identity providers, certainly at this stage. Maybe they will do it at later rounds of procurement.
Thanks. And we'll have one more question from online, and then I think we've got at least two in the room, and I will proceed from the back toward the front. So the last online question.
Sure. This question is from John Krinke. His question is, these are fascinating use cases you're working on. Thank you. The two use cases you mentioned focus on citizen to government interactions. Do you have any plans to integrate enterprise to government use cases into your plans? An example might be a government grant recipient that needs to access grant administration resources. These would be business to government use cases rather than citizen to government use cases.
I guess I should have said at the outset, the part of the government digital services strategy is firstly to create a platform for all of the public sector, but secondly it has a wholesale strategy, which is to deliver public services as APIs so that public services can be consumed within propositions built by the private sector. So we're working with a bank here in the UK to allow a small business, when a small business is created, the first thing that has to happen with that small business has to register with something called Companies House, and then they have to register with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs to create a corporate tax account or a VAT account or such like. Now, at the moment, when they go through that process, they have to do it separately. They have to create each of these accounts individually with each part of government and local government. What we are doing is working with a bank to say, well, the customer's been through the process of establishing the identity to a high level when they created the business bank account. Why can't that identity information simply be passed across straight to Companies House and to HMRC and allow the public sector accounts to be created based on that information? So we're working on how, with that bank on how that would work, and that's an example of how public services will become part of transactions that the customer is doing elsewhere. I was talking to British Airways yesterday. I was saying when I book my holiday with British Airways, which they have a tourist a travel agent website, I could go on there and be told when I'm booking my airline flights that my passport will expire by the time that I'm due to travel. So why couldn't I initiate my passport renewal through that website? That would be a goal for GDS, to be able to deliver the transaction, the public service transaction, at the point where it's natural for the customer to interact with it.
Thanks. So now let's go. I think there's a question somewhere along here. Yes, you.
Adrian Gropper, patient privacy rights. Given multiple identities, how are you managing those services that have to be coercive in terms of a single identity, like, for instance, driver's license points, where drivers shouldn't be using multiple licenses? Where is that coordinated?
So the DVLA in the UK are the organisation that administer driving licences, and they have a responsibility, as you say, to make sure they're only issuing one licence to one person. And so they have to manage the risks around that transaction. Now, if I have met the government standards, it would be very difficult for me, regardless of how many times I provided, it would be very difficult for me to claim to have an identity other than David Rennie, because I've been walking around this country for the last 46 years using that identity, and my address history and such like are reasonably well known and documented. I would have difficulty establishing a different identity at this point. So in the same way that I have 2 or 3 credit cards in my wallet, I could have 2 or 3 different digital identities that I use in different circumstances, each one in different circumstances. But it's the job of the relying party to ensure that they are meeting their responsibilities based on the risks that they as an organisation understand and have to manage. So each organisation is different. If you go to in this country, if you want to work in the UK, you get issued a national insurance number, and we are pretty quick to issue that national insurance number because HMRC are very keen to start taxing people who arrive here. So the process for issuing a NINO, a national insurance number, is relatively low security. But the process for issuing, let's say, a national health number, which would entitle the customer to free healthcare, that's a very different process, and that's based upon the person's need for healthcare. So each relying party understands its business and has to ensure that it's managing its risks and deduplicating its databases appropriately.
So, David, to follow up on that one just a little bit, I think maybe there's a bit of a sort of a hidden undercurrent under the question. Do I take your answer to imply that the credentials that are being issued by the 5 IDPs under the scheme are not designed to support pseudonymous or anonymous access to services, or is that contemplated, and if so, present or future capability?
Well, our contract has been defined around what we call level of assurance 2. So in our standards, we've, much like your standards, we have levels 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and those standards will evolve and become more sophisticated as we start deploying these services. But at the moment, we have levels 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and our contract is based around level 2 identity assurance services. Now, level 1 is a self-asserted identity in our standard, and as a self-asserted identity, I could claim any name I liked and use that in whatever context I wanted to. But the relying party might turn around and say, well, a level 1 identity is not good enough for this transaction, so I can't actually provide you the service that you're after. You have to have a level 2 identity. So it's dependent upon the relying party to state what it needs. and it's up to the individual citizen to meet that need.
And just to be perfectly clear about everything, are there any services currently planned for integration into the scheme which would accept a level 1 credential?
I think there will be many. To be honest, the exemplar program is looking at delivering value for money for individual government departments. They're looking at which transactions can they make cost savings, cost efficiencies from delivering digitally. And so the transactions that are up there on the exemplar list are mostly around level 2. And of course, that's the standard that we have defined most accurately. But I'm sure there will be level 1 services in time. Indeed, there will be level 3 services in time as well.
Thanks. We have another question right here. And don't forget to stand so that David can see you.
So, David, I've been tracking the British government and identity for several years, and I've just got a question I don't have an answer to. Is Patrick Curry's BBFA involved in any of this?
Well, we know Patrick well, and we know the BBFA, but he's a separate organisation with a cabinet office. He's not one of the identity providers.
So the question I had was are y'all standing up a federated service, a federation server? A federation server. Is that your hub? That was the question.
Yeah, the government has built a hub. We call it an authentication broker to begin with, but we just decided on hub in the end. So we have built that, designed and built it.
Great. I think what you're doing is great. It's a wonderful thing. Thanks.
We now have a couple of questions, or at least one question in the back, and don't forget to stand up.
Hi, David. Continues to be fascinating. 1.5 questions. The first one is around unobservability. That's one of the more challenging requirements within the NSTIC vision is unobservability. You're probably familiar that the Canadian government has done this through a double-blind gateway, and I think the F6 effort is considering a similar approach. Can you comment on the requirement for unobservability and how you might be addressing it? The second half question is, have you set some rules of engagement for the IDP vis-a-vis the metadata mechanisms that they use? Now that you mentioned that SAML 2.0 is the protocol, those signing keys become pretty important. Are you placing requirements about the strength of the signing key, the refresh of the signing key at the hub, et cetera?
So I'm afraid this question goes beyond my this goes beyond my level of expertise, unfortunately. In terms of the signing of keys, as you'd imagine, our GCHQ, which is our equivalent of your
NSA.
I forget the name of your organisation over there, but
NSA. You are allowed to say it on an open phone line.
Well, I feel nervous about this topic. So they're heavily involved in ensuring that whoever is signing which pieces of information and how they're being passed around doesn't leave us vulnerable in any way. In terms of the unobservability, we have been at great pains to ensure that we work closely with the UK's privacy lobby. So I worked on the identity card from 2005 to 2007, and a number of organisations were set up over here to complain about the way in which it was being built. There was No2ID and Big Brother Watch, Privacy International, and a number of others. Since that day, in fact, in the report that I worked on, working on what their issues were, we've been very close to them in terms of how we design something that is going to meet with their approval. And so we've started with the notion that the identity provider does not know which relying party the customer is coming to, nor does the relying party know which identity provider the customer has come from. So that's how we have started our initial design. Now that's achieved by obfuscation at the hub, I won't try and explain that over the telephone. What we have discovered is that we do user testing each week. That's one of the golden rules in GDS. Every change, every development is taken through the lab with real users every week. And we have great difficulty explaining privacy to individual members of the public. And we have difficulty explaining many elements of identity assurance to them. Where we are at is that if we give users control, then users can choose what level of privacy they want. And they can identify what the benefits to them will be from giving up some of that privacy. Now, that's all future speak. The first release of this, the first iteration of the identity service, will ensure that the identity provider doesn't know who the relying party is. Obviously, they're going to know who the hub is, and the first service, there will only be one service, so they'll be able to deduce it, we hope, pretty quickly. But the logic should be that identity providers don't know who relying parties are, and then we will understand what users think of that and what implications that has, and we will amend the design as is appropriate.
Thanks, David. We have one more question in the room and one online, and then I think we will allow you to get on with your day. And don't forget to stand and go to camera.
Hi, I'm Kalia. Hi, Kalia. Hi, David. This may be both for you and Don. I, like many people working in this industry, travel the world, and last time I was in the UK, folks were like, what's OIX doing? And I don't know. And so one of the things you named was that you created a contract with them to help facilitate collaboration. And since that's our job here, I thought you could share with us a high-level view of the mechanics of what exactly was done to foster the collaboration. Like,
sure,
what happened? Did you have 4 meetings?
For a while. I'm happy to answer. I might get Don to have a go at this one.
Go ahead, David. Let me answer the question about what is OIX doing. In the case of the UK, OIX is acting as the recipient of a grant from Her Majesty's government. And as that grant recipient, we have really 3 fundamental tasks. One is to chair the identity steering group. So we're the neutral arbiter between the identity providers in that group and the Her Majesty's government. So we act as a convener and a neutral party facilitating decision makings about how those grant funds are to be spent and prioritizing the manner in which they're spent. With regard to the execution of that, all of the pilots or alpha discovery projects that David mentioned earlier go through a process that is open and involves a vote of that identity steering group to decide when and how to stage each of these market tests of different elements of the program that David described. So our goal is to foster a high level of collaboration in a test bed so that both the identity providers and the relying party, those represented by a cabinet office, have early insight into important issues. One is, as David suggested, how mobile devices, data from telcos and mobile network providers can be used by the consumer and by the IDP and by the RPs in a way that is privacy protecting, secure, et cetera. So we're really the managers of the testing environment. As managers of that, we also ensure that all these tests are, the results of which are published They are published by an independent domain expert who assesses these tests and publishes a white paper on the OIX website, on the Identity Assurance Program website, so that the community at large can understand the results of those tests and benefit from them. So we help the governance process. We make sure that that process is transparent. David, are you still there? Okay. I'll try and rattle on while, and the third element is that we as OIX have a mission to promote interoperability, so that what OIX wants to do is provide not only the transparency of the learning in the UK environment, but wherever possible, advocate for the use of open identity standards and interoperability between these identity systems. So from an OIX point of view, we want to make sure that what happens in the UK is understood largely by a global community. The standards developed in the UK can be exposed to a global community, and to the extent possible, we look for interoperability between the systems developed in the UK, those in the US, in Australia, New Zealand, et cetera. So that's our mission, is that threefold group: to be the neutral convener of the identity steering group, to be the administrator of the funds and the authors of the white papers, and to promote interoperability across the board.
So while we're waiting to see if we can reestablish the phone connection, I just want to give... We're good? We're back on. David, are you back with us?
I'm here, yep.
Apparently it was that NSA thing you said that got you cut off. So I gather, based on the timing of the loud beeps, that you probably heard the majority of what Don said. Did you want to add anything to the answer?
No, it sounded obviously a good summary from Don, who's been closely involved in what we're doing.
So I have just two more questions from David Weitzel on the phone, and Laura will now read those to you.
Yeah, these are from David Weitzel. What is the UK's vision for higher than level 2? And will the APIs also include trust elevation techniques to allow transactions classified at higher than level 2?
We haven't defined what we want for higher than level 2 at this moment. That's going to be defined over the next few months and will be part of the next procurement. So that'll be defined by the end of this year, I would have thought. What we are doing, however, is creating what we call a document checking service that allows the passport and driving license to be validated by the identity provider as part of the registration. So that will allow customers to assert their passport number or their driving license number, and that will be part of the way in which you raise your level of trust to level 2. I don't know if that's what was meant by that question.
So let me ask a brief follow-up on that one for you, David. When you say that you're going to develop a capability for the IDPs to examine driving licenses and birth certificates, is that a technical capability, or will there be transmittal of electronic information or transmittal of photographs, or what should we be having in our minds about the process there?
It'll be a service, and that service will only be available to the certified identity providers that the government has contracted with. And that service will literally validate, i.e. provide a yes, no, when the identity provider asks, does this name corroborate with this passport number?
Thanks very much. So thank you very much also for your time spent here with us today, David. That's been very interesting and a good a benchmark for our ongoing work. Don, did you want to say anything before we close?
I have many identities. In addition to chairing the IDESG in the UK, I also help chair with Colin Wallace the IDESG International Committee. So one of the things that we hope to do in the International Committee is to really be the bridge between developments in the IDAP program and that here in the NSTIC program. we think that that's an important part of not only the mission of OIX, but also the mission of community gathered here. So I think in terms of follow-up, some of the work suggested earlier by the Trust Frameworks Committee, their survey of international players, the International Committee, which will meet later this afternoon, can really take an instrumental role in making sure the information exchange is robust on both sides.
Thanks, Don. David, thank you very much for your time today, and we can now let you go to pursue your own activities.
David rings a bell like Downton
Abbey. Thanks very much. And just to back up what Don was saying, keen to follow up on any initiatives to do international projects. Please do get in contact with Don on that. Thanks very much, everybody.
Have a good afternoon, David. So please don't leave yet. Let me, for the moment, give you a description of what the next hour and a half rather, is going to be like. So to begin with, there are going to be no plenary sessions back in this room after this. We will restart tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with presentations from the new pilots. The remainder of today will be birds of a feather sessions and committee breakouts and, of course, importantly, another social gathering. So what we're going to do in a minute is we're going to go outside, and there is lunch once again provided through the good graces of our sponsors, LexisNexis, Authentify, and GTRI. You'll get your lunch. You have a half hour to eat your lunch in peace if you wish to do that, rather than eat it while you're talking in a Birds of Feather session. But the Birds of a Feather session will begin no later than 12:45. The F6 session will be taking place in room 119B, as in Bravo. The discussion of NSTIC appropriate concepts for anonymity and pseudonymity will be taking place in room 119A, as in Alpha. I encourage you not to be lazy and to actually attend one of those sessions. Both of them are highly relevant to the work that we're all doing here, and it would be great to have your participation in one or the other. And if you go to one and you find yourself disappointed or bored, give the other a try. The Birds of a Feather sessions will end in time to get you to the committee breakout sessions at 1:45. We have two parallel tracks of breakout sessions, the first one beginning at 1:45 and running to 3:15. The second beginning at 3:30 and running to 5:15. By the way, again, I'll mention Authentify has a table set up in the hallway, and if you haven't seen the demo of the Authentify technology, it is probably interesting to you and will repay some of the largesse of the food in the breaks that Authentify has helped to provide. Once again, transportation to this evening's social gathering will be a bus. It'll be provided by GTRI. Thank you again very much. And the bus will leave at 6 o'clock. And as usual, I think it'll be like there are two buses and they circulate. And then after the social gathering, you are, of course, free to go about your own personal agenda and reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Are there any questions before we break to go to these activities? Okay, for those of you online, the Birds of a Feather sessions and committee breakouts have web meeting and phone call dial-in information in the online agenda. We are now dismissed to go to those sessions. Thank you very much.